Billionaire dad sees Waitress feed his disabled son. What happens next will shock you. The restaurant buzzed with activity, the clinking of glasses and laughter filling the air. At the far corner, a small family sat, their table draped with a pristine white cloth. A man, sharply dressed in a tailored suit, sat at the head of the table, his brow furrowed as he stared into his phone. His name was Jonathan Reed, a billionaire who had made his fortune in tech startups. He was used to attention, but tonight his thoughts were elsewhere. At the table with him was his son, Oliver. Oliver was different. He was born with a condition that left him unable to speak or move his limbs. A rare neurological disorder that no doctor could fully explain, and one that had caused Jonathan and his wife, Amanda, a great deal of heartache over the years. Yet, despite his condition, Jonathan loved Oliver with all his heart. But sometimes, he couldn't help but wonder if he had failed him. If there was more he could have done for his son, more he could have provided. Jonathan's gaze flickered to Oliver, sitting in his high-tech wheelchair, his eyes darting around the room. The boy's face held no expression, yet Jonathan could feel the weight of his son's silence, the longing in those eyes. He was aware of the stares they often received from others, people whispering about the disabled child, feeling pity for them, or worse, completely ignoring them. It was a hard pill to swallow, but it had become part of their reality. The waiter arrived at their table, offering a polite smile. "Good evening, Mr. Reed. Can I get you started with something to drink?" Jonathan looked up but didn't respond right away. His thoughts were still tangled, and he felt the familiar sting of frustration. He barely noticed the waiter, his mind preoccupied with the image of his son, trapped in a body that couldn't respond, couldn't react, couldn't participate in the world around him. "Mr. Reed," the waiter repeated, drawing Jonathan's attention back. "All right," Jonathan said, clearing his throat. "Just water for now." The waiter nodded and turned to walk away, but before he could get too far, a voice interrupted from the opposite side of the room. "Excuse me, sir," the voice called. Jonathan looked up and saw a young woman approaching the table. She wore the standard waitress uniform, black slacks, a white shirt, and a name tag that read Emily. She had an aura of kindness about her, a warmth that immediately caught Jonathan off guard. Most waitstaff in places like this were focused on doing their job and moving on, but Emily was different. Her gaze softened when it landed on Oliver, and Jonathan immediately felt the protective instinct rise within him. "I'm sorry," Emily said with a gentle smile, "but would it be all right if I fed him?" Jonathan blinked, his brows furrowing in confusion. "Excuse me. I noticed your son is having trouble eating, and I've worked with children like him before. If it's okay with you, I could help feed him." Her tone was soft, but there was a sense of purpose in it, a determination Jonathan wasn't used to seeing from strangers. He glanced at Oliver. He wasn't used to having other people assist with his son's care. It was something that had always been left to him or Amanda. But there was something about Emily's demeanor, her compassion, that made Jonathan pause. He had seen too many people pretend to care, too many people show empty sympathy. But Emily was different. There was an authenticity in her eyes, something genuine. For a moment, Jonathan hesitated. Could he trust her? Was she really capable? But as he looked at her, he saw the warmth in her eyes and the sincerity in her posture. He felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this could be a small step forward for Oliver, for them all. "All right," Jonathan said after a long pause, his voice thick with uncertainty. "Go ahead." Emily smiled and nodded, walking over to Oliver. She gently lowered herself beside him, speaking softly to the boy as she did. Her hands were steady as she adjusted the spoon, guiding it towards Oliver's mouth. Jonathan watched intently, his breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded as he watched Emily take care of his son with such tenderness, such care. It was a sight he hadn't seen in years, someone other than him or Amanda taking the time to truly see Oliver, to treat him with the respect he deserved. Oliver's eyes flickered, a brief spark of recognition. Jonathan's chest tightened. It was as though he had seen a glimpse of something in his son's eyes that he hadn't seen in a long time. Was it hope? Or was it just wishful thinking? The restaurant's ambience faded as Jonathan's focus zeroed in on the small interaction happening at the table. Emily continued to feed Oliver, never rushing, always speaking softly, always present. For the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt a sense of peace. "Is that all right?" Emily asked after a few moments, looking up at Jonathan for confirmation. Jonathan blinked, pulled from his thoughts. Yes, thank you." She smiled again and continued, her movements fluid and graceful. She was in her element, Jonathan realized. It was clear she had done this many times before, and for the first time, he wondered just how much more she knew than she let on. As she finished feeding Oliver, she stood up and stepped back, giving Jonathan a respectful nod. "He's a special boy," she said softly. Jonathan didn't know what to say. How did she know that? How could she see what others often fail to? His heart swelled with an emotion he couldn't quite name, grief, gratitude, or perhaps a mixture of both. But before he could respond, Emily turned to leave. "Wait," Jonathan called out. Emily paused, glancing over her shoulder. "Yes." "How do you know so much about children with disabilities?" Jonathan asked, his voice betraying his curiosity. Emily smiled, her eyes twinkling with something Jonathan couldn't quite decipher. "It's a long story," she said softly before adding, "but I've had my fair share of experiences. Sometimes, you don't need words to understand someone. You just need to listen, and the rest comes naturally." Her words lingered in the air like a soft breeze, and Jonathan found himself stunned. He couldn't quite explain it, but something about her felt different. She wasn't just a waitress. There was something more to her. Something hidden, something deep. As the night wore on, Jonathan's mind raced with thoughts. Who was Emily really? What was her story? And most importantly, how did she understand his son in a way that no one else seemed to? He had to know more. He called for the check, but his mind was elsewhere. He barely noticed the bill being placed in front of him, his thoughts consumed by the mysterious waitress. What had he just witnessed? It didn't make sense, but somehow it felt like a moment of change, a moment that might lead them down an unexpected path. As they prepared to leave, Jonathan paused at the door. The restaurant was nearly empty now, the last of the diners finishing their meals. He glanced around, hoping to see Emily again, to ask her more questions. But she was nowhere to be seen. Curious, Jonathan stepped outside, his gaze scanning the sidewalk. And then, just as he was about to turn away, he saw her. Emily was standing across the street, talking to someone, a man in a hoodie, his face hidden in the shadows. Jonathan's pulse quickened. There was something off about this. Why was Emily speaking to someone in secret? Who was that man? And why did she seem so uneasy? Suddenly, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Emily stood there for a moment, watching him go, before she turned and started walking toward the alley behind the restaurant. Jonathan felt his heart race. Something was happening. Something he couldn't explain. And it wasn't just about Oliver anymore. It was about Emily. He had to know more. He had to understand what was really going on. As he started to move, something deep inside him stirred. An instinct, a sense of urgency. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to uncover something that would change everything. But the question remained. Would it be a revelation of hope, or would it be a nightmare that would shatter the fragile peace he had found that evening? Jonathan's footsteps quickened as he moved toward the alley behind a restaurant, the cold night air nipping at his skin. His breath came out in visible puffs as he rounded the corner, his heart pounding in his chest. There was something about Emily, something he couldn't put his finger on, that seemed to pull him toward this unknown truth. His mind raced, turning over questions faster than he could process them. Who was she really? Why had she spoken so cryptically about understanding Oliver without words? And why had she been speaking to that man in the shadows? The alley was dimly lit by a single flickering streetlight, casting long shadows across the narrow passage. Jonathan squinted, his eyes searching for any sign of Emily. He paused, his back pressed against the cool brick of the restaurant, listening intently. The city sounds echoed around him, distant honking horns, the faint hum of traffic. But there was something about the silence in the alley that made him uneasy. It was as if the world around him had fallen away, leaving only the pulse of his own thoughts. For a moment, there was no movement. Jonathan stood motionless, his senses heightened, waiting for any clue that would explain what he had just witnessed. The interaction between Emily and the mysterious man kept replaying in his mind. There had been an urgency in her voice, a brief flicker of fear in her eyes as she glanced back at the man. And then, when he disappeared into the night, Emily had seemed relieved. But why would she be speaking to someone like that? What was it about tonight that had shifted her into this secretive mode? Jonathan's gut told him that he was on the edge of something much larger than a simple act of kindness. It wasn't just about feeding his son anymore. It was about Emily, about the subtle yet undeniable connection she seemed to have with Oliver. It was almost as if she understood his son on a level that no one else did. And that thought, along with the strange encounter in the alley, was enough to make Jonathan feel a surge of urgency. He stepped forward, his shoes scraping against the gravel beneath his feet. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, a faint rustling, followed by a soft voice. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. "Emily?" He leaned forward, his eyes scanning the alley again. There, in the dim light, he caught sight of her. She was standing by a door, her back to him. As she spoke to someone on the other side, Jonathan hesitated, the instinct to turn around and leave warring with his need for answers. He was not the type to intrude on someone's personal life, but something told him that if he walked away now, he would never understand what had just happened. And so, with a deep breath, he stepped closer, trying to move quietly as he approached the edge of the alley. His eyes narrowed as he saw Emily's silhouette once more. She was now on the phone, her words a mere whisper carried by the wind. Jonathan strained his ears to listen, but the words were muffled, too soft to hear clearly. It didn't matter. The way she was speaking, the urgency in her tone, the subtle fear lacing her words, was enough to make his stomach tighten with unease. Then, suddenly, Emily turned sharply, her eyes locking onto Jonathan's. Her expression was unreadable at first, but there was a flicker of recognition that passed across her face, quickly replaced by a guarded look. For a brief moment, the air between them felt charged, electric, as if the tension from their earlier exchange had carried over into this strange encounter. "Mr. Reed," Emily said, her voice steady despite the situation. "What are you doing here?" Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. He had expected surprise, perhaps even suspicion, but the way she spoke, calm, almost resigned, made him pause. It was as though she had anticipated his arrival. "How? I couldn't help but notice something," Jonathan began, his voice low. "Earlier tonight, you said something. You mentioned that you had experience with children like Oliver. And then, I saw you talking to that man. What's going on, Emily?" His voice faltered slightly as he spoke, the weight of his questions pressing heavily against his chest. Emily's expression softened for a moment, but her eyes remained guarded. She took a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly, though there was still an undeniable tension in her posture. "I didn't want to involve you in any of this," she said quietly. "It's complicated, dangerous even. But you're right to ask. You've seen too much already." Jonathan's pulse quickened. Dangerous? What did she mean by that? "Who was that man?" he asked, his voice trembling with the urgency of his need to know the truth. "What's going on, Emily?" She glanced over her shoulder, as if checking to make sure no one else was watching. The alley remained empty, but she lowered her voice even further. "His name is Gabriel. He's part of a group, one that I've been involved with for a while now. They're looking for someone very important, someone who could change everything. And unfortunately, your son Oliver is at the center of it." Jonathan froze. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His son? At the center of something dangerous? The world around him seemed to blur as he tried to process what Emily was saying. "What do you mean he's at the center of it?" Jonathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his heart hammering in his chest. "What do they want with him?" Emily hesitated, her eyes flickering with an emotion Jonathan couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps. Or regret. I can't go into the details right now, but I'll tell you this. Oliver is special, Jonathan. He has abilities, gifts, that you don't even know about. And there are people who will stop at nothing to exploit those abilities. They've been watching him for a long time, and they'll do anything to get to him. Jonathan felt as though the ground had been ripped from beneath him. He had always known that Oliver was different, but this? Abilities? Gifts? It didn't make sense. How could his son, who could barely communicate, have something that would make him a target for dangerous people? Why haven't I seen any of this? Jonathan asked, his voice shaking. How could I not know? Emily's gaze softened. It's complicated, and it's not your fault. There's a lot you don't understand about Oliver's condition. He's not just disabled, Jonathan. There's more to it. Much more. She stepped closer to him now, her voice urgent. Look, I can't explain everything in one conversation. But I'm telling you, you need to protect him. These people, they're coming for him. And I'm the only one who can help you keep him safe. Jonathan's mind was racing. The woman standing in front of him was a stranger, yet she seemed to know more about his son than he did. More than any doctor or therapist had ever said. His world was crumbling around him. The foundation of everything he thought he knew about his son being torn apart by the possibility of something far more extraordinary and dangerous than he could have ever imagined. How do you know all of this? Jonathan demanded. Why are you helping us? Emily took a deep breath, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. Because I've seen what happens when people like Gabriel get what they want. I've seen the destruction they leave behind. And I won't let that happen to Oliver. Jonathan's head was spinning, the weight of her words pressing down on him with suffocating force. He had thought that his wealth, his influence, his ability to protect his family would keep them safe. But this was something else entirely. Something he couldn't control, couldn't fix with money or power. I don't understand, he whispered, more to himself than to her. I don't know what to believe anymore. Emily's hand gently touched his arm, grounding him in the moment. I know it's a lot to take in, but you need to trust me. I'll do whatever it takes to help you protect Oliver. We don't have much time. They're getting closer, and once they find out where he is, it'll be too late. Jonathan looked into her eyes, searching for any sign of doubt, but he found none. There was only a quiet, unwavering certainty. And, as much as he wanted to walk away, to pretend this wasn't happening, he knew he couldn't. Not after everything he had just heard. Not after seeing what he'd seen in Oliver's eyes. He had no choice now. He had to protect his son. And he had to trust Emily. But what happened next, Jonathan had no way of knowing. The game had changed. The stakes had been raised. And the clock was ticking. Jonathan's mind reeled with what Emily had just shared. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the winds were pushing him toward an unknown future. The ground beneath him seemed to be shifting, and no matter how tightly he gripped the edge, he couldn't shake the feeling that something irreversible had already happened. Oliver, his innocent son, was now at the center of something far bigger than any family drama, any corporate rivalry, or any issue that Jonathan had ever faced in his wealth-driven corporate life. He'd thought he could protect his son with money, with power, with his status in the world, but none of that seemed to matter now. How do I protect him? Jonathan's voice broke the silence, quiet yet filled with desperation. If I can't even understand what you're telling me, how do I protect him? Emily's gaze softened, but there was still that edge to her expression, the urgency that didn't allow for a moment's peace. She stepped closer to Jonathan, her voice now low and intense. You're not meant to protect him alone, Jonathan. Not anymore. You need to understand that Oliver is different in ways that most people don't even know how to process. He's not just a child with disabilities. He has an ability, one that could change everything. His mind works in ways that can influence the world around him, and there are people who are aware of that, people who would do anything to control him. Jonathan looked at her, disbelief still clinging to him. What do you mean? My son. He can't even talk. He can barely move. How could he possibly have abilities that could change anything? Emily shook her head, Her eyes filled with a sadness that pierced Jonathan's heart. I know you want to protect him, but that's the thing. You're looking at him as though he's fragile, as though the limitations you see are all there is. But there's more to it than that. Much more. Jonathan swallowed hard, the weight of Emily's words sinking in slowly. His chest tightened as the sense of helplessness began to creep in. All his life he had been in control. Control over his businesses, control over his wealth, control over his world. But now his son was the one who was beyond his reach, and Jonathan had no idea how to protect him from this unknown danger. Tell me everything, Jonathan finally said, his voice hoarse. I need to understand. I need to know what's going on. Emily hesitated for a moment, glancing around the alley as though ensuring they were still alone. Then she stepped back, her eyes scanning the area one last time before she spoke again. I can't give you all the details, not yet, but I can tell you this. Your son's abilities are tied to something ancient, something far older than the world as we know it. They've been tracking people like him for years, Jonathan. People who possess what they call the gift. A gift that allows them to see the world differently, to shape the reality around them in ways that aren't possible for most people. And Oliver is one of them. Jonathan felt his breath catch. He wanted to argue, to tell Emily that this was insane, that none of it made sense, but the look in her eyes, the raw honesty and fear, stopped him. She wasn't lying. She was trying to help him, trying to help Oliver. But the implications of what she was saying were too vast, too terrifying for him to fully comprehend. You said there are people looking for him, Jonathan managed, his voice a little steadier now. Who are these people? What do they want with Oliver? They're part of a secret organization, a group that's been around for centuries, Emily explained. They're known by many names, but most people refer to them as the Order. They believe that those with the gift are the key to something much larger, a shift in power, in influence, in the very fabric of reality itself. They want to control it, and they'll stop at nothing to get to Oliver. Jonathan's mind spun as he tried to process the weight of her words. An ancient group, a secret organization, a shift in reality. It all sounded like something out of a thriller novel, something that had no place in his world. And yet, here he was, standing in an alley with Emily, a waitress who seemed to know more about his son than he did, talking about forces beyond his comprehension. He felt as if the rug had been pulled out from under him, and now he was falling, faster and faster, into a world he didn't understand. I don't understand, Jonathan said, his voice breaking as he grappled with his emotions. I don't know how to fight something like this. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Emily's expression softened, and for a moment she looked almost motherly, as if she were looking at him the way a teacher might look at a student who was struggling to grasp an important lesson. You don't have to fight it alone, Jonathan. That's why I'm here. That's why I've been watching Oliver. I know what they want. I know how to protect him from them. But it's going to take more than just hiding him away. It's going to take strength, trust, and the willingness to believe in things that you can't see or explain. Jonathan shook his head in disbelief. I'm supposed to believe in this? He motioned to the darkness around them. In some ancient group and my son's abilities? Emily's gaze hardened. Yes, Jonathan, you have to believe. Because if you don't understand what's happening to him, then it's going to be too late. He stared at her, his mind clouded with questions, with fear. What happens if it's too late? What if I can't protect him? What if? Emily cut him off. You have to trust me. I know what I'm doing. But you have to be willing to listen, to follow my lead. We don't have much time. Before Jonathan could respond, a noise echoed in the distance. A car engine, loud and unmistakable, was coming down the alley. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat as he realized that the danger was closer than he'd imagined. His thoughts raced, panic surging in his chest. Who was that? Were they here for Oliver? Had they already found him? Emily, Jonathan breathed, his voice low and urgent. They're coming. We have to go now. Emily's eyes widened, and without another word, she grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the side door of the restaurant. Jonathan followed, his heart hammering in his chest, the weight of the unknown pressing on him from all sides. They moved quickly, silently, like shadows in the dark, slipping inside the door just as the car engine grew louder. They were inside now, but Jonathan's anxiety was only growing. He had no idea what was happening, no idea who was after them or why, but one thing was clear. His life had just changed. There was no going back now. Jonathan started, but Emily cut him off with a sharp gesture, urging him to stay quiet. She led him through the back corridors of the restaurant, her footsteps swift and purposeful. Jonathan couldn't help but notice how easily she moved, how confident she was in this unfamiliar place. It was as though she had been here before, as though this were a world she knew inside and out. "This way," Emily whispered urgently. She paused in front of a door, glancing back at Jonathan with a look that held both fear and determination. "You need to get Oliver. We have to leave now." Jonathan's heart was in his throat. He had no idea what was going on, but he couldn't waste any more time. "I'll go get him," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Emily nodded quickly. "Hurry. We don't have much time." With that, Jonathan rushed through the corridors, his mind set on one thing, getting Oliver to safety. But as he moved, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spiraling out of control. There were forces at play that he couldn't begin to comprehend, and the realization was both terrifying and unsettling. By the time Jonathan reached Oliver's room, the panic had set in fully. His son was asleep, peaceful and unaware of the storm gathering around him. Jonathan stood in the doorway, watching him for a moment, the gentle rise and fall of his son's chest doing little to calm the turmoil in his own heart. He didn't know what to believe, but one thing was clear. If he wanted to keep his son safe, he had to trust Emily. And the clock was ticking. Jonathan stood at the doorway of Oliver's room, watching his son's peaceful form. Every rise and fall of his chest, every gentle flutter of the boy's eyelids, sent a shock of overwhelming protectiveness through Jonathan. His son, who had been nothing but a blessing since birth, was now at the heart of a conspiracy far beyond his comprehension. And in that moment, Jonathan realized how fragile the world he had built around his son truly was. It wasn't enough to protect Oliver with wealth, with influence, with the sprawling fortress of luxury Jonathan had created for him. No, it was going to take something much deeper: trust, belief, and a willingness to embrace the unknown. The kind of unknown that Emily had just introduced him to. The urgency of the situation hit him like a freight train. He couldn't afford to hesitate. He couldn't afford to doubt. If Emily was right, then Oliver was in more danger than Jonathan could imagine. An ancient group, the Order, bent on controlling people like Oliver, was coming for him. They would stop at nothing to exploit whatever power his son possessed, and if they succeeded, nothing would be the same again. As Jonathan crossed the threshold into Oliver's room, he felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him with every step. He had always been the one in control, the one who called the shots. But now, his son's safety was in the hands of someone else. Someone he barely knew, but was now trusting with everything. He bent down beside the bed, his fingers brushing gently against Oliver's cheek. The boy shifted slightly, murmuring in his sleep. Jonathan's throat tightened. How could this innocent child hold the key to such power? And why had it fallen to Jonathan to protect him? He had never asked for any of this. But the truth was, he didn't have a choice. His son's life, his future, was hanging in the balance. "Oliver," Jonathan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He reached down and carefully scooped the boy into his arms. It felt natural, the way his son nestled into him, as if they were meant to be together in this moment of uncertainty. "We're going to get out of here. I'm going to keep you safe. I promise." As Jonathan lifted Oliver, he heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching the room. Panic surged through him. Emily had said they didn't have much time. The people coming after them were close, too close. Without a second thought, he turned on his heel and bolted for the door. He could hear the soft murmur of voices from the other side of the house, the faint scrape of shoes against the tile, signaling that the intruders were already inside. He sprinted down the hallway, every step feeling like a lifetime. The house was eerily silent. The only sounds were his hurried breathing and the faint scuff of his footsteps echoing off the walls. He had no idea where Emily had gone, but the one thing he knew for certain was that they needed to get out. Now, Jonathan rounded a corner and came face to face with an unfamiliar figure, a tall, shadowy figure blocking the exit. His heart skipped a beat, and his grip on Oliver tightened instinctively. The figure didn't say anything at first. It just stood there, watching Jonathan with cold, calculating eyes. The man's posture was relaxed, almost too relaxed, and Jonathan could sense that he was waiting for him to make a move. The man stepped forward slowly, his expression never changing. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice smooth but laced with an unspoken threat. Jonathan's pulse quickened. He wanted to ask who he was, what he wanted, but the urgency of the moment drowned out any rational thoughts. All he knew was that he had to protect Oliver at any cost. Without thinking, Jonathan took a step back, his instincts kicking in. He didn't have time to reason with this man. He didn't have time to do anything except get away. He turned to run, but before he could make it more than a few steps, the man lunged at him, grabbing his arm with an iron grip. Jonathan fought back, pushing the man's hand away, but he was stronger, faster. The man twisted Jonathan's wrist, forcing him to drop Oliver. Jonathan gasped in pain, but his eyes never left his son. He had to protect him. He had to keep him safe. "Let him go," Jonathan growled, his voice low and dangerous. The man didn't respond. Instead, he glanced over Jonathan's shoulder, his gaze flickering toward something behind him. Jonathan followed his gaze, and his blood ran cold when he saw Emily standing in the doorway, holding a gun. "What is this?" Jonathan demanded, his voice rising in disbelief. "Emily, what the hell is going on?" Emily's eyes met his, and for a moment they were filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Jonathan," she said, her voice steady despite the situation. "But you don't understand. I'm trying to protect Oliver. I'm trying to save him." Jonathan felt a surge of betrayal. "From what?" he shouted. "What the hell are you talking about?" Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with sadness. "From them, Jonathan. From the order. I've been protecting him for years, keeping him hidden from the people who would use him. I never wanted you involved. But now they know where he is." Jonathan's mind raced. He felt as though the ground was being ripped out from under him, like everything he had known to be true was collapsing. Emily, the waitress who had come into their lives seemingly by chance, was somehow connected to the order. She wasn't just an innocent bystander. She was part of the game, and he had no idea how deep it went. The man holding Jonathan suddenly released him, shoving him back with a sharp force. Jonathan stumbled but didn't fall. His eyes remained fixed on Oliver, who was still lying on the ground, confused and vulnerable. "Get out of the way, Emily," the man said, his voice clipped. "We've come for the child." "No," Emily said, her voice firm. "You're not taking him. Not this time." Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. The truth was becoming clearer with every passing second. Emily had been working against the order all along, doing everything she could to keep Oliver safe. But now, it seemed like they had reached the point of no return. The order wasn't going to let this go. They would stop at nothing to control Oliver, to manipulate whatever power he held. And if Jonathan didn't act now, they would take his son, and everything Jonathan had worked for, away from him. "Do you think you can stop us?" the man asked, sneering at Emily. Jonathan's mind was spinning, but suddenly everything clicked into place. He had to make a decision, right now. There was no more time for hesitation, no more time for fear. He had to do whatever it took to save Oliver, to protect his son from the forces that were closing in around them. With a roar of determination, Jonathan surged forward, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her away from the door. The gun fell from her hand, clattering to the floor. The man reacted instantly, lunging at Jonathan, but he wasn't fast enough. Jonathan had already moved, already made up his mind. With a fierce shove, Jonathan knocked the man off balance, sending him sprawling to the floor. "Go!" Jonathan shouted, his voice hoarse with urgency. Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. Together, they scooped up Oliver and made their way toward the back exit of the building. The sound of footsteps grew louder, but Jonathan didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. The only thing that mattered now was getting Oliver to safety. They burst out of the building into the cool night air, the streets empty and silent around them. But Jonathan knew the danger was far from over. The Order would never stop hunting them. They would never stop coming for Oliver. But Jonathan had made a vow to his son. No matter what it took, he would protect him. As they disappeared into the night, Jonathan realized that the world he had once known was gone. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. But he didn't care. He would fight for Oliver, for his son's future, no matter the cost. And with that, Jonathan took the first step into an uncertain world, ready to face whatever came next. And though the road ahead was unclear, Jonathan knew one thing for sure. He would never let them take his son. Never again.